In the middle of a sun-bleached New Mexico nowhere, Eleanor Ellie Grant was fighting to hold on to something the world had long stopped noticing: her father's motel. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't profitable, but it was hers, a place built on duty, dust, and quiet honor. For years, she patched its broken bones with duct tape, grit, in the memory of a Marine who taught her what loyalty looked like. Then on a night when the wind screamed and the rain struck sideways, a silent stranger appeared on her doorstep. No name, no past, just eyes that had seen too much. She gave him shelter without question. What she didn't know was that this act of quiet compassion would awaken a legacy long buried beneath the sand. What began as a storm would become a resurrection of a building, of a mission, and of countless lives seeking one last place to feel whole again. This isn't just a story about saving a motel. It's about what happens when you open a door and hope walks through. He didn't say thank you, just nodded once slowly and made his way to the heater, his boots squelching with every step. Ellie handed him a towel, and for a long while they said nothing. She returned to the desk, pretending to review an old ledger, but her eyes flicked to him every so often. He didn't fidget or fuss, just stood there, absorbing the heat, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the past. Later, she gave him a room key, room 4, one of the few without exposed wiring, and showed him where the extra blankets were stored. He moved slowly, stiffly, like someone who'd learned to live with pain instead of fixing it. As he disappeared down the hallway, Ellie stood at the threshold, the storm shrieking against the windows, and wondered what kind of man wandered into the desert with nothing but a backpack and a 1,000-yard stare. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the sky still hung low, heavy with ash-colored clouds. Ellie rose early as always, swept the porch, brewed the coffee, extra strong today, and flipped the switch on the neon sign. The missing S still hadn't returned. She thought about him, whoever he was, but didn't go knocking. She figured if he needed something, he'd come. He didn't, not for hours. When he finally stepped out, his hood was down, and the lines on his face were clear. Older than she'd first thought, maybe late 40s. His hair was dark, peppered with gray, and his eyes were the color of wet slate. Still no name, still no story, just a simple morning, and then silence as he accepted a cup of coffee and sat on the bench outside, staring into the distance like he was listening for something far away. For the next few days, he became part of the background, moving like a ghost between the office and room 4. He never asked for anything, never complained. Once, Ellie saw him picking up litter from the gravel lot, quietly fixing the latch on the back gate. Another time, she caught him helping a stranded motorist with a flat, not saying a word, just working until the job was done. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. Something in his presence felt familiar, not in a way she could name, but in the way a song from childhood lingers long after the lyrics are gone. He reminded her of the men who used to come through when her father was still alive. Quiet men, tired men, men who'd seen too much and said too little. 5 days passed, then 6. Ellie knew she was running out of time. The fire marshal would be back soon, and she hadn't fixed a thing. The bank wasn't calling. Her savings were nearly gone. She'd begun boxing up old linens and tossing broken furniture, trying to make the final goodbye feel less like a failure and more like a transition. She told herself she was fine with it, that she'd held on long enough, but it felt like losing her father all over again. On the 7th morning, she opened the office drawer and stared at the deed. Desert Star Inn, handwritten signatures from a time when people still did things face to face. Her father's name, bold and proud. Hers, in careful print beneath his. She closed the drawer before she could cry. That afternoon, the wind changed. She felt it before she saw it. A low rumble, deep and steady, rising through the bones of the building like distant thunder. Dust rose on the horizon. Ellie stepped outside, shielding her eyes. The sound grew louder. And then, like a scene out of an old war film, military jeeps began to appear, one after another, rolling through the haze like phantoms from another world. Camouflage paint, antennae whipping in the wind. Men in uniforms scanning the motel like they were approaching a target. Ellie's heart stopped. They parked in a loose semicircle. One soldier stepped out, Then another, and then she saw him, the stranger, cleaned up now, in uniform. Bars on his chest, stripes on his sleeve. He approached slowly, hat in hand. "I owe you an explanation," he said quietly. Ellie didn't speak. Couldn't. She just stared at him. "My name is Major Ben Rourke. I served with a classified division under the Department of Defense. We've been off the grid for years. When I got separated from my unit during transport, I didn't want to compromise their position. So I disappeared." She blinked, still silent. "You gave me a room when no one else would have. You didn't ask questions. That kind of grace, it's rare." Behind him, more soldiers were stepping forward. Engineers, electricians, men in fatigues hauling toolboxes and ladders, studying the crumbling motel like it was a mission site. He looked back at them. "I called in a favor." And just like that, the Desert Star Inn came alive. They started with the roof, fixed the leaks, reinforced the joists. Then they moved to the wiring. Rooms 3 through 7 lit up for the first time in years. The breaker box was replaced, smoke detectors installed, gutters scrubbed and repainted. Even the neon sign was repaired. The S flickered back to life like it had just been sleeping. Ellie stood on the porch, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, tears in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't carrying it alone. For the first time, she felt like her father would have smiled. That night, the sign outside glowed in full, Desert Star Inn, and beneath it, painted in fresh navy blue on the wooden fence, were 4 simple words: "Veterans always welcome here." And somehow in the quiet after the storm, a legacy long thought lost found its way home. He limped slowly toward the heater, favoring one leg. As he stretched his hands out to the warmth, Ellie caught sight of something faint on his wrist. An old tattoo, barely visible now, but unmistakable. The eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps faded almost into his skin, but still proud in its silence. "You serve?" she asked gently. He nodded once, not looking at her, eyes fixed on the glowing coils. "Long time ago." "Me too," she replied, quietly. "Sort of. My dad, Korea and after, ran this place for 30 years. That made him look. For the first time, he turned toward her. His eyes were sharp beneath the wear, a shade of gray that carried both intelligence and caution, like someone who had learned not to trust the world too quickly. "You keep it going?" he asked. She gave a half-hearted shrug. "Trying. Room 6 still has heat if you want it." "I don't have—" "It's not about that," she interrupted, holding up a key. "Just take it." He hesitated. A long pause. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. She handed him the key without asking his name, and he didn't offer one. 20 minutes later, she knocked on the door of room 6, holding a folded blanket and a chipped mug of hot tea in her hands. When he opened the door, his jacket was drying over the heating vent, and his boots were lined up neatly on a towel by the wall. The room smelled like damp wool and stillness. "I figured you might need this," she said, holding them out to him. He took the blanket and tea with a careful kind of hesitation, like someone who had long forgotten what kindness felt like. "You didn't have to," he murmured. "I know." He stared at the steam curling up from the cup, watching it as though it were something sacred. "You always take in strays?" he asked. Ellie chuckled. "Only the quiet ones." He offered a faint smile, fleeting and uncertain, like a reel of old film flickering once before going dark again. Later, they sat on the porch in silence, listening to the steady patter of rain. He didn't talk about where he'd been, and she didn't ask. No questions, no pasts, just shared stillness, a mug of tea, and a soft kind of peace that didn't need words. He never asked for sympathy, and she never gave any. What she offered instead was shelter, and the space to simply be. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the motel showed its wounds like reopened scars. Rain had seeped in under the awnings, and a downspout had ripped completely off the side of room 3, letting water pour straight onto the doorframe. Ellie stepped out into the gravel with her second cup of coffee, sighing as she mentally tallied the rooms that would be too damp to rent for the week. She didn't hear him approach, just sensed a shift behind her. The man from room 6, still without a name, stepped up beside her and wordlessly grabbed the opposite end of the soaked mattress she'd been dragging toward the dumpster. They didn't speak, didn't plan. Together, they hoisted the heavy thing across the gravel and dropped it by the trash bins with a loud, wet thud. Then he turned and walked away, not saying a word. 10 minutes later, Ellie glanced toward the supply shed, expecting it to be locked like always. But the door was open. The light was on. Inside, the man was crouched over a crate of old tools, most of them rusted, long forgotten. He pulled out wire cutters, a dented hammer, and a few lengths of copper pipe that hadn't been touched since her father died. That afternoon, without asking, without instructions, he replaced the broken gutter on room 3 using scrap tin and old metal brackets. By dusk, he had cleared a clogged drainage pipe and patched 2 holes in the roof using roofing tar, his instincts, and a wobbly old stepladder that should have been retired years ago. The next day, Ellie found him beneath the front desk, rewiring an outlet that had only worked if you jiggled it just right. He never asked if he could help. He just did, like it was muscle memory, like it was a promise to someone who wasn't there anymore. He never whistled, never muttered to himself, never asked for lunch. He just worked. Ellie sat on the porch and watched from a distance, boots resting on the step, coffee in hand, as he reattached siding, tested breakers, adjusted smoke detectors. She'd hired contractors before, expensive, noisy, showy, and none of them worked half as hard as he did or with half his focus. This man moved with reverence, like silence was something he'd earned and meant to protect. She found herself thinking, he moves like someone who used to lead, but now just wants to be needed. But the moment that stayed with her, long after, came just before sunset on the 3rd day. She was digging through a box in the wash storage room looking for a spare low-light bulb. The box was marked Dad, Keep, and inside was a jumble of old metal scraps, faded invoices, and sketchbooks filled with notes on small repairs her father had intended to make someday. At the very bottom, beneath a folded Marine Corps blanket, lay an old military cap, faded, sweat-stained, and worn from time. She lifted it gently and placed it beside her coffee on the desk, just to free up space in the box. She didn't even hear him walk in. He froze mid-step, eyes locked on the cap. Something shifted in the air. Without a word, he walked over slowly, like pulled by something deeper than gravity. He picked up the cap with both hands, carefully, reverently, and held it against his chest. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there, motionless, the room steeped in silence. Then in one fluid motion, he lifted the cap and pressed it gently to his forehead. A salute, precise, quiet, and full of weight. Afterward, he placed it back on the desk exactly as he'd found it. He turned then, facing Ellie, who stood still in the doorway. Whoever wore that, he said, voice low and even, was someone you didn't forget. Ellie's throat tightened as she whispered, "My father." The man didn't say another word. He simply gave her a small, respectful nod, then turned and stepped back outside to finish reattaching the heater vent in the lobby. That night, the motel didn't seem quite as broken. It still carried the familiar scent of damp carbon and old rainwater. The roof still groaned in the wind, but something had shifted. Not in the walls or the wiring, but in her. It wasn't just about fixing things anymore. It was about memory, about honoring what had once been. The next morning arrived too early for anything but the bitter comfort of coffee and silence. The kind of desert morning where the sun still lingered behind the hills and the world felt like it was holding its breath. Ellie stepped out to get the mail, just routine at this point. Bills, ads, a coupon for a car wash she'd never use. And then she saw it. A plain white envelope, stamped with the town's seal in heavy blue ink. It was the kind of envelope that felt final before you even opened it. Official, unapologetic, and cold in its weight. She already knew what it would say. Still, her fingers tore it open, as if the words inside might offer a different ending this time. They didn't. Final notice, immediate action required. Her eyes moved over the familiar bureaucratic language. You are hereby given 10 days to comply with Fire Code 203C. Failure to install updated smoke and carbon monoxide detectors in all guest rooms and to replace the primary electrical panel to meet code will result in revocation of your business license and permanent closure of premises. She read it again, and then again, slower. It didn't matter how many nights she'd spent sealing leaks with duct tape or running extension cords from the laundry room to keep the lights on in room 4. The city didn't care about effort or heart. They wanted signed permits, certified electricians, inspections, and money, more than she had. More than she could even imagine finding, and no one had offered to help. Ellie sat down on the old front bench, the letter trembling in her hand. The wooden slats creaked beneath her. Around her, the motel remained asleep. Doors closed, windows dark, except for room 6. The light was on, as always. He was already awake. She didn't hear him approach, only felt him, quiet and steady, like the desert wind. When she looked up, he was standing just a few feet away, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. One look at her face, then the envelope in her hand, and he didn't ask questions. She handed it to him without a word. He read it silently. His jaw clenched as his eyes skimmed the cold lines of city policy. When he finished, he folded the letter once and gave it back to her. "How bad?" he asked. Ellie's voice broke before the words formed. "It's over." "That bad," he said quietly. He hesitated, his brow furrowed like he wanted to protest, to find a way out. "I could take another look at the panel," he offered gently. "Maybe it's not as—" "No." She cut him off with a shake of her head. "It's not just the wiring, it's everything. The permits, the inspections, the certifications. I can't afford any of it. I tried the bank again. I called the county office. Even reached out to the Veterans Business Fund." She gave a small, bitter laugh. Everyone had the same answer. "Sorry." Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. "I kept this place because it was my father's. Because it felt like the only piece of him I still had. But maybe that's not enough anymore." He didn't say a word. He just stood there, rag in hand, staring at the cracked porch railing like it held some secret answer. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked back to room 6. The door clicked softly behind him. By morning, he was gone. No rattling toolbox in the gravel. No quiet footsteps near her window. Room 6 stood open, stripped of any trace he had ever been there. Ellie stepped inside. The bed was neatly made, trash emptied, heater still running, cover screwed back in place with quiet care. On the desk sat the room key and a single piece of paper, torn from the old guest ledger. Her hand hovered before picking it up, nervous, unsure of what it might say. The handwriting was blocky, deliberate. 3 lines. That was all. "You did what others wouldn't. Now let's see what happens when we do the same." No last name, no phone number, no forwarding address, just that. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and slipped it into her wallet. She didn't know what he meant, didn't know if he was coming back, but somehow the motel felt different. Still quiet, still hollow, but full too, achingly full. The desert outside was quiet again. Too quiet. Ellie moved through the skeletal shell of what once had been a living place, out of rhythm more than purpose now. She folded linens that would never be used, packed boxes no one would unpack. The storage room stood empty. The vending machine had been unplugged. The front desk bell, polished to a soft bronze shine, hadn't rung in days. Tomorrow the city would come. They'd change the locks, condemn the place. Her father's motel would cease to exist. She had told herself she was ready, but peace doesn't usually taste like rust in your throat or settle behind your eyes like a storm. She was sealing the last cardboard box in room 2 when she heard it. A low rumble, distant but steady, like thunder buried deep in the bones of the earth. It had started with a clear day, then another, and then more, as if the desert sky had conspired to offer her a stretch of peace before everything changed. Ellie was mid-task, tape in hand, halfway through patching a window frame when she heard it. Not the wind, not the distant whine of a semi barreling down the interstate. This was louder, heavier. Engines. Not just one, but several. Her heart lurched. She didn't think. She just moved, bolting for the front door, flinging it open, and stepping onto the porch just as a thick wave of dust swept across the gravel lot. For a breathless second, she braced herself, expecting a dust storm. But this wasn't wind. It was a convoy. 12 military jeeps, all painted in crisp olive drab. the shine of fresh wax and brand new tires catching the morning light, came tearing through the Desert Star's entrance like something out of a movie. Their headlights glared through the haze like searchlights, slicing clean lines in the rising dust. One after another, they turned in perfect synchronicity and came to a stop, bumper to bumper, forming a protective arc around the front of the building. Ellie couldn't move. She stood frozen, her flannel sleeves shoved to her elbows, hands still smudged from scrubbing, chest rising in stunned silence. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on the lead Jeep as the door opened. And then he stepped out, the man from room 6. But he wasn't the limping, rain-soaked stranger who checked in days ago, silent and forgettable. Now he stood tall, his back straight, shoulders squared. He wore the full dress uniform of the United States Marine Corps. Polished black shoes, slacks pressed with perfect creases, ribbons and medals gleaming across his chest like stars. The gold nameplate read, Dalton R. Colonel, U.S. Marine Corps. Ellie felt her breath hitch. Her brain scrambled to reconcile the quiet guest with the man before her. He walked toward her slowly, his expression calm, almost regretful, gentle in a way that made her chest ache. Ray? Her voice cracked as it left her throat. He nodded just once. A soft smile touched the corner of his lips. After I left, he said, evenly, nodding toward the vehicles and the people now stepping out. Men and women, some in uniform, others in plain clothes, many with tool belts or duffel bags slung over their shoulders, faces set with quiet resolve. I made a few calls. He paused, letting that settle. To the people I served with, the ones who still believe in things like honor, to organizations that help veterans rebuild, to foundations that remember what sacrifice looks like. He looked past her shoulder at the warped siding and the aging wood. But this time, he continued, softer now, we're not rebuilding for us. His eyes met hers again, unwavering. We're rebuilding for you. Ellie's mouth opened, but no words came. She felt like the floor had tilted beneath her. You didn't ask, Ray added, stepping a little closer. You just gave. That's what made it matter. Behind him, the movement had already begun. Volunteers were unloading gear, extension cords spilling from crates, paint cans being stacked on tarps. Ladders leaned carefully against the building. A woman in a navy cap was studying what looked like an ancient wiring schematic. Ellie had no idea it still even existed. Another woman wearing a knit beanie was calmly checking each smoke detector as if it were routine. Ellie stood there, motionless, her thoughts a swirl of disbelief and wonder. But why? She finally whispered, barely audible. Ray's gaze never wavered. Because sometimes, he said, all it takes is one open door to remind people what home looks like. The air shifted then, not with wind, but with meaning. Drills began to hum. Laughter echoed faintly, warm and unforced. The sound of boots crunching on gravel. It didn't feel like construction. It felt like something deeper. It felt like redemption. And it all began not with a hammer, but with silence. The reverent kind of hush that fills the space when something sacred is about to happen. No one barked orders. No one saluted. There were no speeches, just movement, hands pulling on gloves, toolboxes opening, steady footsteps, ladders being propped up against tired siding. They worked like a unit that didn't need commands, each one knowing their role, their purpose. Colonel Raymond Dalton, no longer just Ray, the quiet guest in room 6, watched over it all. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Everyone around him understood that this wasn't a job. It was a mission. The old frayed fuse box Ellie had been terrified of for years was rewired in less than a day by a team of former Navy electricians. New carbon monoxide detectors were installed in every room, tested and double-checked. A nonprofit crew from Colorado hauled in lumber, hardware, light fixtures, and gallons of paint. They moved in pairs, trading jokes under their breath, laughing with the kind of bone-deep weariness that only those who've seen darkness can still carry with grace. Their laughter didn't break the silence. It healed it. By midweek, room 7, once a cramped linen closet, had been reborn. It was now a reading room. Soft chairs lined the walls, low shelves filled with donated paperbacks and journals. A handmade window seat, sanded smooth and anchored with care. Harris, a former combat medic, Built it himself. A place to breathe, he said simply, tightening the last screw. Out back, the desert lot that had once been little more than a graveyard of rusted junk and broken glass was transformed. Volunteers cleared it, planted low-water shrubs, 3 young shade trees, and laid a winding stone path. At its center stood a small sculpture of a folded flag surrounded by bricks etched with names. Brothers, sisters, friends, lost but remembered. As the sun began to set that evening, the memorial garden stood in solemn peace, quiet, still, but filled with more life and meaning than Ellie had ever imagined it could hold. Just beyond the garden shed, once a chaotic jumble of rusted tools and busted vacuums, stood something no one expected. A chapel, simple and unassuming, more like a single-room sanctuary than a grand house of worship. It had wide, open windows that welcomed the desert light and handmade wooden pews that gave off a rustic, tender warmth. The moment Ellie stepped inside, she could feel it. It wasn't just a structure. It was peace carved into wood and light. A local vet from Albuquerque, now a carpenter, had hand-carved a wooden cross for the wall. No one said what religion it belonged to. No one needed to. Rye, walking beside her, simply said it was a place for reflection, for remembering or maybe for forgetting, even if just for a little while. By the 7th day, the entire place felt transformed, almost unrecognizable. What had been a forgotten husk was now breathing with intention and care. The walls, once cracked and peeling, had been repainted in soft, hopeful tones. The sagging roof had been reinforced and stood proud again. The beds were clean, the heaters working, the light fixtures no longer flickered but glowed steadily. Even the vending machine, with its new light and hum, looked like it had been waiting for years to be part of something meaningful again. Then came the moment none of them would forget. Late afternoon, when the sunlight stretched across the gravel and cast long shadows that danced across the lot, the community gathered near the driveway. A new sign had been placed, carved in bold letters and set into stone. Desert Light Veteran Lodge. Flowers framed it on either side. Ray stood there, cap in hand, an old veteran who had been part of this rebirth. A young ROC cadet stepped forward and unfurled the flag with practiced hands. The flagpole had been installed that morning, and now, as the red, white, and blue climbed slowly toward the sun-drenched sky, Ellie felt something deep within her shift. Her knees buckled slightly. The tears arrived before she could prepare for them. But she wasn't crying because of all the paint or electrical wiring. She cried because for the first time in years, this place wasn't just about holding on to her father's memory. It was about building something new, a future. And when the flag reached the top and rippled high above the roofline, everyone present instinctively stood a little taller. The building wasn't just a restored motel anymore. It was a promise, a home, a beginning. The paint hadn't even fully dried on the new sign when the first guest arrived. A beige sedan rolled up with California plates and parked under the carefully trimmed mesquite tree by room 4. Ellie stepped him out to greet her, towel thrown over one shoulder, clipboard in hand, expecting another traveler just passing through. But the woman who emerged was tall, silver-haired, wearing a navy cardigan and clutching an old, carefully folded flag to her chest. Her voice was soft, gentle. "Just for the weekend," she said, smiling with a kind of warmth Ellie hadn't felt in years. "My husband was a Navy man. We used to pass through here on our way to Roswell. I heard about the new name, Desert Light. He would have liked that." Ellie nodded, the lump rising in her throat making it difficult to speak. But she managed. "Welcome home," she said, and she meant every word. The next day, Travis arrived. A Gulf War medic, rough around the edges, rode in on a Harley with a service dog and a sidecar. Goggles on, vest snug. He didn't talk much, stayed 2 nights. On the second evening, Ellie found him in the reading room, sitting quietly, thumbing through the things they carried while resting one hand gently on the dog's head. He didn't look up when she passed, but as she walked by, he murmured, almost like a secret, "I didn't know I needed this." A few days later, a young woman showed up, maybe 20 or 21. She wore auroch greens, her posture straight, her eyes alert. She had driven in from Flagstaff, determined to find one of her grandfather's old platoon mates, a man rumored to be staying nearby. "He thinks no one remembers," she told Ellie. but I do. That afternoon, she and the old man sat together for hours in the chapel. Just the two of them, talking, laughing quietly, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence as the warm desert wind blew gently through the open windows. Later that same week, a man checked in with barely any paperwork. His file was sparse. No emergency contact, no special requests. A recommendation from a veteran recovery program in Texas was all they had. He had a traumatic brain injury, spoke little, and looked at the world with far-off eyes. But on the third morning, Ellie caught sight of him in the courtyard. A Marine vet was playing an old guitar under the canopy, and then something shifted. A smile, faint and fragile, crept across the man's face. It was small, easy to miss. But to Ellie, it felt like watching sunrise after a long dark night. She turned quickly, blinking fast to hide the tears in her eyes. That night, she picked up her father's old journal, the one he used for maintenance notes and radiator sketches, and began to write. "Healing doesn't always wear boots," she wrote. "Sometimes it moves in silence. Sometimes it shows up with no plan and finds a place that asks for nothing in return. This place, it isn't just where they rest. It's where they remember. And maybe where they start again." She closed the journal gently and stepped outside. The sun was dipping low, casting its last light on the sign that now bore her family's legacy. They were coming, not in crowds, not with marching bands or ceremonies, but one by one with their stories, their burdens, their hopes. Ellie never imagined she'd leave New Mexico. She certainly never pictured herself standing on a stage in Washington, D.C., under the bright lights of a hotel ballroom. But there she was, modest, navy dress, her father's locket around her neck, addressing a crowd filled with generals, program directors, and senators in polished shoes. She gripped the podium with trembling hands, but her voice stayed steady. "I didn't plan any of this," she began, and she meant it. She hadn't planned a revolution. She hadn't drafted a master strategy or rallied troops with fiery speeches. Ellie Grant had simply opened one door, just one, and watched as others, guided by their own courage and longing for dignity, walked through it on their own. There was no thunderous applause when she finished speaking that day. The crowd didn't erupt. They sat still, hushed, not out of politeness, but because they were genuinely listening with their hearts, not just their ears. Because what she had said wasn't about policies or proposals or the tired language of funding and frameworks. It was about people, about worth, about what it means to truly be seen. 2 weeks later, Ellie was home again, not in the old sense of the word, where broken ceilings dripped and yesterday's paint peeled away from forgotten walls, but home in a way that spoke of reclamation and healing. She sat quietly on the steps of the newly renamed Desert Light Veteran Lodge, the name catching the last warmth of the setting sun as the night sky stretched open above them like a prayer. Beside her sat Ray. No dress blues, no medals pinned to his chest. Just a flannel shirt faded from use, scuffed boots, and the unguarded expression of a man who had finally found rest, not just in his body, but in his soul. They didn't speak at first. They didn't have to. Some silences carry more than words ever could. And then, as if plucking a thought straight from Ellie's heart, Ray leaned in slightly and said, his voice soft and sure to hunt, "Peace isn't something you find out there." He touched his chest gently, his hand resting over where old wounds used to ache. "It's something someone has to show you in here." Ellie didn't reply. She didn't need to. She just smiled, closed her eyes, and let the desert night settle over her like a warm blanket. Calm, vast, and endless. In a world spinning faster with each passing day, it's far too easy to overlook the quiet corners. The places kept alive not by money or headlines, but by grit, tenderness, and the fragile persistence of memory. Places where people like Ellie Grant choose to stay, to rebuild, to remember what matters even when no one else is looking. This story may end here, but its echo continues. Desert Light Veteran Lodge might be a work of fiction, but its heartbeat is anything but. Across this country, there are thousands of Ellie Grants, men and women who hold on to places the world has forgotten, who protect stories that deserve to be heard. And there are still many Colonel Daltons, veterans who move quietly through the world, still serving in ways that may never make headlines, but carry immeasurable weight. So maybe the real question isn't about the door Ellie opened. Maybe the question is, have you ever opened a door like that? Literally or figuratively, one small gesture of courage, kindness, or presence that changed someone's life, or maybe your own. Or did someone once open a door for you when you needed it most? We want to hear those stories, your father's, your neighbor's, your best friends. Let this be a space where dignity isn't buried under the noise, where kindness is remembered out loud. And if this story reached something inside you, please like it, share it, subscribe. Not for clicks, but because somewhere out there, someone is still holding the door open, and they need to know they're not alone.